We are recording.
Thank you, Leslie. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this AIM Center webinar, where we'll be talking about how to create accessible documents and slide decks. We're so glad that you're taking time out of your schedule to join us this afternoon. We're really excited to see those numbers go up in the chat. And speaking of the chat, we would love for you to use the chat to interact not only with the panelists and the rest of the room, but with each other, because I'm sure you all have valuable information to share, valuable insights. We also invite you to share on social media what you learned from this webinar with others who you think might be interested in this content. You can tag us. We're at cast_UDL, just to make sure that we see your post. And then please use the hashtag AEM, the number 4, and all, ALL. Again, that way we can see your post. And also, just to let you know that we do have closed captioning support for this webinar this afternoon. And I want to thank Mike from ACS Captions for providing those captions this afternoon. It's a great service that they provide, and we're really excited to be able to bring that to you. To view the captions, you'll need to find that closed caption button in the Zoom interface. It's usually a CC button, and then you'll be able to follow along with the captions. And then just another reminder that we are recording this webinar, and I'll make that reminder again in the middle of the webinar. And a link to that recording will be available within about a week of the webinar taking place this afternoon. And you'll be able to find it in the same place where you registered for the webinar. And by the way, I would invite you to visit that page and take a look at the other webinars in this series, because this is an entire series. And we've done 2 of them, one focusing on personalizing the reading experience with a number of different tools, and one on creating high quality and accessible videos. So check out the recordings from those, and also some supporting resources like the slide decks, the handouts, and so on. So lots of content on the AIM Center website to help you create more accessible content. All right, so with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started with our webinar. So this afternoon, again, we're going to be talking about accessible documents and slide decks. And the presenters this afternoon, I'm going to introduce my wonderful colleague, Mindy Johnson. So Mindy, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hey there, everybody. I'm Mindy Johnson. I'm the Director of Digital Communications and Outreach at CAST. I'm also a former special education teacher, and I'm really excited. I always learn something when I work with Luis, so I'm excited to be here with you today.
Great. And I'm Luis Perez. I'm a technical assistant specialist with the National AIM Center at CAST. And I have the privilege of working with Mindy. And then we also have a couple of colleagues who are helping us out this afternoon. We have Leslie O'Callaghan, and she's going to be popping in some links into the chat and some instructions for you on how to get a certificate if you need it for this webinar, and some other reminders. And then we also have Janet Peters from the National AIM Center Insights, and she's going to be helping us with flagging the questions. Because as you can imagine, when we have so many people on the webinar, that chat can really be fast and furious. So we really appreciate the help from both Leslie and Janet. So thank you both for being here with us this afternoon. All right, so let's just go over the objectives for this webinar, what we hope to cover over the next hour. We're going to provide you with some simple steps that you can take to make your next document or slide deck more accessible and inclusive. We're going to share a number of AIM Center and CAST resources. So this webinar is just the start of your learning for the week. It's really meant to provide an overview of the content, but then there'll be additional resources available on the AIM Center website to support this learning related to the topic that we're covering today. And then we have a nice challenge for you at the end, which is creating an accessible social media post where you get a chance to reflect on what you learned from today's webinar. And Mindy is really a social media guru. So tell us a little bit, Mindy, what you do for CAST in terms of social media.
Sure. I actually run all of CAST social media and all of the social media for all of our centers. So it keeps me busy throughout the day. I used to run about 23 social media accounts. I'm decreasing that a little bit as we consolidate some of our accounts, but I really love it. I run my own social media accounts too, so it's a lot of fun. But I've learned a lot about how to create an accessible social media post, or more accessible. And the platforms have also increased their accessibility as I've sort of been on this journey at CAST. So I'm excited to share that with you.
Yep. And then also, of course, when we're sharing on social media, we might point to a set of slides, or we might point to a handout. So that's where this is all, how it's all connected, right? We want to make sure that we're sharing accessible resources and that we're doing the sharing in an accessible way. So we have the right person in Mindy this afternoon to share that with us. So as I mentioned, the webinar will provide you with an overview of the topic, but then we have additional resources on our AIM Center website. Two of those resources that I think you'll find really helpful are these 2-page handouts, and they're available in print-friendly PDFs and also screen reader-friendly PDFs because they're tagged for accessibility. So they're both start with the title, Getting Started With, and then there's one for document accessibility, and this one for presentation accessibility. And so we're going to draw on both of those handouts for the content this afternoon, but just know that you'll have those resources available on our website for you to check out. The other thing to let you know is we just discovered this afternoon that Zoom has disabled the live links in the chat. So if you're seeing, Leslie is sharing the links, but you'll probably have to copy and paste those and enter them or paste them into your web browser to access them. We apologize. That's something new that Zoom is probably doing for security reasons. We're not sure, but we'll try to figure that out. All right, so in order to help the practices, help you remember the practices that we're going to be sharing this afternoon, we've created this simple mnemonic, and it's called SLIDE. And the idea is that we're going to focus on just 5 practices that you can get started with right away to create more inclusive learning experiences when you share documents and when you share slide decks. And SLIDE stands for styles, links, images, design, and actually I've changed the empathy more recently to evaluation. And so we're going to cover each of these in a little bit more detail. Also, bonus points for any of you that records yourself doing the electric slide while you go over these tips and shares it with us on social media. Just something fun that we would love to see. All right, so I'm going to get started with the first one here. Actually, Mindy, I'll let you go on this one, the styles one. So why don't you go ahead and take that one. Still there, Mindy?
Just got back. Sorry about that.
No worries. All right, so I'll let you take the S for styles.
All right. So you may have noticed that little heading up at the top of your Word document or your Google document or any other word processing program that you use. And it says styles. And what that does is it's more than just making your text look pretty or look organized. It's actually to help with the organization of your document. So for example, when you are structuring your document, it's a great idea to start with that first heading, a heading 1, and then you go down, there's a heading 2, there's a heading 3, all the way down to, I think, heading 9, that are styled appropriately for people who use those visual cues, but also styled appropriately so those that use a screen reader can also access your content in an easy way. It's also really important to nest those styles properly. So you don't want to start your document, for example, with a heading 3. That won't make any sense to a screen reader. You also don't want to skip over headings. So Luis has this really great example here of a well marked up document in an outline form. It's just like an outline. So you start with your heading 1, that's your title of your document, so making documents accessible. Then your heading 2, another heading 2, which is, it's fine to have those at the same level, and then a heading 3 that is input from the heading 2, just like an outline. These actually are very different than in slides though. So in slides, you actually want to make sure that you're using your master slides appropriately. So the heading actually goes in that title space, and each one of your slides will need that title in the title area.
Great, thanks for sharing those tips, Mindy. So I have the next letter in slide, and that is the L for links. And again, when you're creating a document, we want to make sure that we provide a good experience in terms of navigation. And so not only can screen reader users skip around a document by using the headings, but they often can bring up a list of the links, and so that they can choose which links they want to follow. And so we want to make sure that we label those links appropriately so that they make sense when they're accessed on a list without the remaining content for context. So here's an example of that. There are two links on the screen, and they both say click here. And you've probably seen variations of this. You may have seen about, or learn more, or even just the word here. Well, when they're accessed on a list like this, then by removing that context, it's really difficult to determine what resource we're going to access with each of these links, or what's going to happen if the link points to an action, like downloading a file and so on. So on the next screen, we've improved this a little bit. So now we have more descriptive and meaningful text that we've made the link. So here now you know that one of these links points to the CAST website, and you know that the other one points to the AIM Center website. So it's just important to avoid that generic text, link, here, click here, and so on. The other thing is that not everybody may be clicking. So that vocabulary of clicking, it's been with us for a long time from the world of computers, but people may be on a mobile device where they're tapping, or they may be accessing the content with an alternative means of access. And so they may not necessarily be clicking. And then the last tip related to links is to avoid what we call naked URLs. So a naked URL is basically the entire web address is put into the document or the slide, as I've done here. And Google Docs is particularly, it's one that does that a lot because it's difficult to get a unique link to a Google Doc or a Google Slides presentation. But what we want to do instead is select some descriptive text and then make that the link. So we're hiding that naked URL. We're putting some clothes on it through that descriptive text. So just to get you to experience it a little bit, I'm going to try to play this here, and then we'll see if you're able to hear it. But this is just going to read out loud that entire Google URL. Actually, let me just exit out of the slide deck for a second. Leslie, I'm just going to stop sharing because I think I forgot to enable the sound. So give me 1 second while I do that. Looks like I do have it enabled. Okay, great. Just wanted to make sure so you get the best experience of this demo. All right, so I'm going to play the icon here with the sound on it, and hopefully you'll be able to hear this.
https://docs.google.com/presentation/D/1I3LG6CSQYDW53HB77210XYPRWT3U-IF.
All right, so everybody got that? There's going to be a quiz at the end. No, I'm just kidding. There is no quiz. But again, you can hear how difficult it is and confusing to determine what that link is all about just by hearing that long URL. So just putting some clothes on it with some descriptive text, whether it's in a document or a presentation, that goes a long way towards providing a more meaningful and easier experience for screen reader users and for others as well. So I will now pass it on to Mindy, and she's going to talk about the I in slides, which is images.
https.
Hey, Mindy, before you jump into that, I just wanted to let you know that there was a question, and maybe you guys will address it at the end, but the question was, is there any tool to assess the document's accessibility?
There
Actually,
is.
yeah.
Yeah, we'll cover that a little bit at the end, but if we don't, we'll come back to it as well.
Okay, and one more question that you can take or come back to. How do you put the descriptive text in place of the link?
Well, usually it depends on the tool that you're using, but in Microsoft Word, the way that I do it is I'll select some text. So I'll basically draw a highlight, or select it. And then the easiest way for me is to just right click and choose link. And then that will bring up a dialog box where I can put in the URL or the web address. And then that will create that link for me. And the process is very similar in Google Docs or other tools. You'll select descriptive text, right click, or press a keyboard shortcut, or there may be an option in the menu bar. Generally, I use with a right click quite a bit, it just saves me time. And then I will bring up that dialog for the link and then create it that way. Any other tips, Mindy, or does that cover that?
Nope, that pretty much covers it. When I'm in Microsoft, I usually select the text and do Control K or Command K. And that's a pretty relatively universal way to add a link to text. You can even try it in other programs, but that's the way I do it.
Yep, it saves a lot of time. Any other questions?
Yep, a couple other questions. And so a question from Jennifer, is there an advantage in regards to accessibility between Office 365 and MS Office?
So I'm assuming older versions of Office. I would say that if you are able to use Office 365 or 365, depending on which way you want to say it, there are some advantages in terms of what Microsoft has done for the alt text, where it's not as confusing as it used to be. There used to be a couple of fields where you would put in a title and a description, and it wasn't always clear which one was the best option. Well, in Office 365, Microsoft has cleaned that up a little bit, and there's just one field now for alt text. And I would also say the accessibility checker, kind of getting to the question that somebody else asked, I think it's more robust in the latest versions of Microsoft Office. It's been around for a while, but of course, whenever you have the latest version, it takes into account all the latest updates and the latest improvements in some of the technology.
Great. And there was another question on audio, on an audio file of how to insert audio into the slides. And then Lisa later clarified knowing how to insert the audio, but don't know how to make the audio file in the first place to attach, is I think what that question is.
And that's a little bit beyond the scope of what we're going to cover today, but that gives me a chance to mention that if you have those questions, keep them coming, because even if we don't get to answer them during the webinar, what we've been doing with these webinars is at the conclusion of the webinar, we collect all of these questions and then we update the handout with a Q&A at the end. So if we don't get to your question, or the question may be a sort of a tangent from the topic, not to worry, we will address it. It's just maybe not in the webinar itself, but we'll come back to it, in the handout. So let me Janet, I'll continue on and then we'll pause again. I want to keep mind of time, make sure we don't run out of time. So I'm going to turn it over to Mindy, and she's going to talk about images.
Great, thanks, Luis. So for any image that you put in your slides or your documents, they should all have some kind of alt text. And what this does is it provides an alternate representation for those who use a screen reader or those who may not be able to access the image that you have in the document or your slide deck. So there are three typical types of images that you'll find in documents and slide decks. There's decorative, which indicate that they shouldn't be read by screen readers. So a decorative image, for example, are the three colors on the left side of these slides that we have right now. I wouldn't describe that for a screen reader. I would actually just mark that as decorative because it has no meaning. I'm not referring to it necessarily in the slides or my presentation. There's also a functional image, and those usually act as hyperlinks. So you might use them as a button on your slide deck, or you might see them in the document and you click them to find out more information. And they describe the destination or the action that you want people to partake in. And then the third type is informative, and this is the one that we're probably most used to. And then when an image is informative, what you want to do is provide a concise description. And you don't want to describe absolutely everything in the image unless it's important to the goal of that image. So there's some things that you also want to think about in terms of the goal of your images. So the basic guidelines for image descriptions, you want to understand the purpose of your image and the context of the image. So what context is this going to be in, and why is the image there? Is it decorative? Is it functional? Or is it informative? And then you start, if it's informative, you start with a broad overview or the big picture. What is this image? What is it of? What can people get an idea of what it is in just a sentence or less? And then you focus on a few relevant details. Again, thinking of the goal, the purpose, and the context of the image. And you describe any important relationships that you find in the image. And concise is always better. So here's an example. What do you think the best alternative text for this image might be? You can write your answers in the chat.
Yep, this is a great time to interact in the chat. And again, there's no right or wrong answers.
That's right. There's no, I'm seeing a lot of people saying Epcot. There's a water, some people are recognizing that this is Disney World. There's a fountain with sculptures, nice. A fountain sculpture, Disney. And you know what? You're actually all right. The problem is you didn't know the context or the purpose of the image. So this was kind of a trick question. But if we're assuming that this is a function or an informative image, yes, something like a photograph of the Epcot Center. If the Epcot Center is the important thing about this image, if it's important that the reader or the participant knows that this is Epcot Center, I would absolutely put that in. Of course, if this were actually talking, if this was an art book, I might say that this is actually 2 different colors of blue in this photograph. And I wouldn't even mention that it's Epcot Center. So really, it really depends on the context and the purpose of the image. It could also, if it were a functional image, it might link you to Epcot Center. So it might actually be a link to Epcot Center. And in that case, the alternative text that I would include would be link to Epcot Center.
Sorry about that.
And so how you do this, and actually Microsoft Office 365 has some great tools for adding accessibility to your documents and slides. You right click on the image and you choose Edit Alt Text. And actually Microsoft has gotten so smart with Office 365 that it actually automatically describes that image for you. But it also is often a little bit vague. So for example, I put a picture of my dog in the slide deck and there was more context around him. The alt text just said a dog, which is fantastic that the AI actually recognized that it was a dog and not a person. But I wanted to add a little bit more context around it. So I actually edited the alt text, and you can do that when you open it, when you open up this dialog, and you can describe it a little bit more, just like we did here. Instead of pouring water, we said a pitcher dispensing water into a glass, because that was more descriptive and more meaningful for the context that this was in. You can also mark it as decorative, and then in that case, it will notify the screen reader to just skip over that particular image if it was just there for decorative purposes.
And I would add, Mindy, too, that sometimes you might mark it decorative if it's already described in the surrounding text.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. I forgot about that context, Luis. Thank you for reminding me. Yeah, sometimes we describe an image right within our text, the body of the text. And instead of repeating that description for screen readers, I mean, how annoying would that be? We actually mark that image as decorative because we do describe the rest of the image in the body of the text itself. We do that a lot in textbooks, for example.
I don't want to interrupt you, Mindy, but there's a couple of pertinent questions that might be good to answer at this point.
Great.
Sure.
The description and a caption. So the difference between a description and a caption.
Great question. Yes. So a caption is actually something that sighted viewers see too. So these alt text and captions are different. And we're not talking about closed captions here. We're talking about the captions that usually appear right below an image. A screen reader will read that as well. So you don't want the text of that caption to actually be the same text as the alt text. The alt text really describes the image for somebody who can't access that image or can't see it. So they're very, and the caption might be something like, for more information about Epcot Center, go to Walt Disney World. That might be that might be an example caption that you would have in addition to the image that we were talking about that was Epcot Center. But does that make sense? Did that answer the question?
I think it makes perfect sense. So the caption
Great.
is really more supplementary information about the image.
Yes.
It's not a replacement for it. Whereas
That's right.
the alt text is a replacement for the image for somebody who can't see it.
That's right. And there, I see a question in there about how to add alt text in Google Docs. You actually do almost exactly the same thing in Google Docs that you do for Microsoft 365, and that's right-click the image and then go to edit alt text, or I think it just says alt text.
Yep, I think it is alt text. The only thing to be careful with Google Docs is that, like older versions of Office, it does have two fields. One says
Yes.
title on it, one says description. You want to make sure you use that description field, because if you transfer that document to another format like PDF or EPUB, which are just different formats for documents, then it's only the description field that will transfer. So, you know, again, Microsoft Office has cleaned that up a little bit with just one field, but if you're running an older version, you may still see two fields for it, one title and one description. Just pretend that the title field is not even there. Just use the description field.
And can you clarify, Mindy, on the marking it decorative, you don't need to also then type in decorative as the alt text?
That's correct. Yeah, if you mark it as decorative, you don't have to do anything else. If there's not that option, however, what I would do is I would add the text null, capital N-U-L-L, as the alt text of that image, because that is a standard way to mark something as decorative for a screen reader.
Yep, good advice, Mindy. And we have shared in the handout a number of resources, again, where you can learn more about image description. WebAIM has an excellent tutorial with lots of examples, so you can see how the same image, depending on the context, can be described in different ways. The Web Accessibility Initiative has a really nice decision tree, and it takes you through the questions that you would ask. So again, what kind of image is it? Is it informative? Is it descriptive, decorative? Or is it functional? And then it takes you through step by step until you narrow down the description that goes along with that image. And then we haven't talked about this yet, but there are times when you have a more complex image. I'm thinking of a chart or a diagram where it's, you know, you need more than just alternative text. You need what is called a long description because, you know, it's a more complex image with more parts to it. So the Diagram Center has an excellent guide to complex images, like charts, like diagrams, like flowcharts, and how you would describe those. And in fact, we have an example of how to do that later on in this presentation. So these are great resources for you to check out. They'll be available on the handout, and then Leslie has dropped them into the chat as well. Any other thoughts, Mindy, on image description? Before we continue?
No, but just another plug for the Diagram Center. If there are any STEM teachers in the audience, the Diagram Center has fabulous resources for describing those charts and graphs and complex scientific diagrams that you have in a lot of your content.
Yeah, and before we go on, the other tip that I would share is something that we've ourselves done on the AIM Center. If you have a complex image or just an image that you're not sure of, do it as a group. Make it a collaborative activity where a couple of you share what would be a potential description for that image, and then together you arrive at, you know, what's the best description based on the context and the purpose. That's something that really helped us out with some icons that we were creating for the accessibility, one of the accessibility sections on our website. So I'd highly recommend doing it as a you know, collaborative activity because there's multiple perspectives. And also if you have a content expert and someone who's more technical, well, those are different skills, right? So bringing them together can be really helpful for developing the best alternative text, the best image descriptions. All right, so the D in slide, so far we've covered SLI, so styles, links, and then images. The D is for design, and it's for those things that you can do to, through design, create a better experience for everyone. So I'm gonna share this one, and then I'm gonna pass it over to Mindy because she's an expert at typography. But thinking about contrast, making sure that there's good separation between the text and the background is really important because we want people to focus on the content rather than straining their eyes to see the information. And so one of the tools that I use is a free tool called Color Contrast Analyzer. It's from the Paciello group. And it's, in addition to being free, it's cross-platform. So you can use it on the Mac and on Windows. And typically I just open this up at the beginning of the day and just let it sit on the side. So whenever I'm designing or creating a document, if I need to check the color contrast, I can do that really quickly using a color picker that's built into this tool. So you can choose the background, you can choose the foreground, and then it tells you if it meets the requirements for accessibility under the web accessibility standards. And so it's really helpful to use a tool like this to make sure that we're meeting those minimum contrast requirements. So contrast is just one of those design elements where with a simple change, sometimes it's just making the color just a little darker, we can create a much better experience for everybody. And speaking of design, Mindy, what about typography? Is that important?
Typography is incredibly important. So I have actually learned a lot of these tips from both Luis and our design team at CAST. They are typography experts, and typography is almost as important as the images to help people understand your content even better. So for screen reading, sans serif fonts are actually better for body text. So serifs are actually those little tiny lines that are on some characters. Like for example, Times New Roman is a serif font. We are using 2 sans serif fonts in this slide deck. We're using Arial Black for the titles, and we're using Lato or Lato, which is a Google font, for the rest of the text on the screen. Those are both sans serif fonts. Also, avoiding italics and underline for emphasis. Italics, especially in long chains of text, are really, really difficult to read. And underlines actually look like links. So if you need to emphasize some text in your content, in your documents or your slides, try to use bold to emphasize those important words and phrases. Also, please don't rely on color alone to highlight information. Here is an example of we used color alone to highlight the important information in that sentence. To people who are colorblind or who may have printed out your document or your slide deck in black and white, cannot see your emphasis or your highlight of the information. So to fix this, what I might do is to bold the color alone that's in red right there. Also, try to avoid all caps. First of all, in digital context, it sounds like yelling. So if you're ever in a chat room or if somebody was typing in all text or all caps in the chat box, I would think that they were yelling at me or somebody else in the room. So we really want to avoid all caps. It also is actually harder on our eyes to read all capitals than it is to read either sentence case or title case in our slide decks and our documents. Also, if you want people to, this is kind of counterintuitive, and it took me a while to get used to this, but if you want people to pay attention to your content, you gotta left align it. Please try to avoid justification of text, which makes it sort of line up on either side. And please try to avoid centering text. Titles excluded from that in some cases. But it's much harder to read those centered paragraphs or those justified paragraphs because the spacing in between them is not equal. It makes it hard for somebody with visual difficulties to get the rhythm of the text. And the center text is just way more difficult to read than left justified. In English, of course. In other languages that use different justifications, we want to go for whatever is the norm for that, for a particular language. And do you have any others? Are there other things that you think about when you think about typography? I don't know, Luis, if you have any others other tips that you have.
Well, there was one that was embedded in this slide. It was where it says, don't rely on color alone. You'll notice that I also included the word important in text. And the reason for that is even if I were using bold, screen readers don't always pick up that styling. There are ways that you can enable that in your screen reader, but it may not be turned on by default, that it reads that something's in bold. And so it's always good to have, if you want to highlight something, include the word important or note, something that the screen reader can pick up as text would be important. And I see some great suggestions in the chat. So the font size being too small, that's often an issue. Having busy backgrounds, that's one that I see a lot in presentations, especially. Again, that busy background is going to make it more difficult for the person you're following along with the presentation to determine what's the important thing in that slide. So it can really impact on their focus and their attention. And it also makes the text much harder to read. In terms of the minimum font size, so I would say the American Printing House for the Blind has some good suggestions. I think they mentioned something like 24 for the body text and 30 for the titles. I have a simple test that I do, and you may want to try this. Whenever I'm creating a presentation, I just set it to 50%. And then I go across the room, and if I can still see it at 50%, that's a pretty good indication that if I'm presenting in a room, that people will be able to see the text. So that's just kind of a simple workaround for me. But yeah, I wouldn't go below, say, 24. Anywhere between 22, 24 would be fine for the body text.
And those are for slide decks. For print documents, you really don't want to go, if you want to print these out, you don't want to go below 12. But if you want to adhere to large print standards, you actually don't want to go below 16 or 18 point font. And it does matter whether you're printing, what size paper you're printing on and all of these other things. But for digital text, try not to go below 16 or 18 point if you want to adhere to large print standards. Try not to go below 12 if you want people to be able to read it without magnifying glasses.
And there was a question a little earlier that when you mentioned color, Ron asked, can you explain how contrast ratio works? For example, the 3.3:1, what do those numbers mean?
Oh, how much time do you have? There are scientific aspects to this, but it just has to do with the luminosity ratio. So those colors against each other, what's the luminosity difference? And luminosity, I think, is just a big word for brightness, relative brightness. So there are standards, and the standard is 4.5 to 1 for regular text, and then it's 3 to 1 for large text. So large text is defined as 18 or higher, or 14 and higher if the text is bold. So again, that's something that over time people have found that those ratios work the best in terms of being able to read on the screen. And again, we could point you to some of the supporting research, but as long as you use some of these tools that allow you to pick out the colors, then all you need to see is where it says passed or fail, and then you can go from there. Any other questions, Janet, that we can address?
Yes, there are a few more questions. Let me just go back to my document. Sorry about that. Can you revisit the justification? Kelly asks, why is it important to avoid justifying the content? I have coworkers who insist on this and would like to explain.
So I'll take a crack at it, and I know I have good support in Mindy's got my back. So what happens when you justify, like Mindy said, is the spacing gets thrown off a little bit. It's not consistent between the words. And so what will happen is that you'll see, if you look at the block of text, you'll see what are called like rivers of white. So basically it looks like there's a river of white spacing going through that block of text. And if you're somebody who's distracted, well, that may be what you focus on. And so it can just make it a little bit difficult to process that information and to focus on it and be able to take it in. So ideally, you would have that spacing be consistent for making the text easier to read. Does that make sense? Mindy, back me up.
Absolutely. How's this for backup? I couldn't have said it better myself.
I like that.
Yeah, makes sense to me.
And I also see a related question here about dyslexia-friendly fonts.
Yes.
So the research on that is somewhat mixed. So you'll see studies that say, oh, they help, and there's studies that say they don't make any difference. To me, it's a preference for the end user. And so we have tools now where people can change it on their end. And if that's something that works for you, that makes the reading experience easier for you, then I say go for it. Turn on that feature. But we want to start with a good baseline, and usually a sans serif font at a good size, and that, you know, it's not italicized or has underlining on it. That's a good baseline for ensuring that the font is readable to as many people as possible.
It's also another plug to use styles in your documents and because those styles actually the user, if your students or your participants download your document or are looking at it through Google Slides, if they just change the normal style, they can change the entire text in the document to that whatever font they choose. It's almost like a CSS style for that document. So it's another reason to style your documents well and format the headings well.
And there is another question, and I don't know if you want to get this granular, but between Verdana and Arial, do you find Verdana to be easier, and it talks about illustrations and easier to read, or is that rare?
I don't make necessarily font recommendations other than they should be sans serif and you should be able to read them easily. And if you have questions, ask some of your users, ask some of your students, ask some of your participants, is this easy to read or is it distracting? Usually text that are fonts that are specialized with a lot of extra, swirls and serifs and things like that are much more difficult for your users to read. They're fine maybe for a social media post as long as it has alt text. But for content, we really want to stick to regular, good old, Microsoft or Google fonts.
Yep. I couldn't have said it better this time.
Excellent. We're such a good team, Luis.
All right. So are you all sliding into accessibility yet? I hope you are, because we're getting to the last letter here, which is the E for evaluate. And the great news is that if you're using Microsoft Office products, there is a great accessibility checker built in. You just go to the review tab of the ribbon. So that's the part at the top of the screen. And you choose the check for accessibility option. Or Mindy, what about in Google Docs? What would you use?
Actually, Leslie just put it in the chat. Grackle is an add-on for Google Suite that will, that's a great accessibility checker that you can add on to your Google Suite. There is a free version and there's a pay version. So you can choose which one works for you.
Yeah, and then the last thing I would add on the accessibility checkers is, as it says here on the slide, keep in mind their limitations. So we always emphasize learn the best practices and then use the accessibility checkers as a way to check your work as much as possible, because they can identify some issues. Like if you're missing alternative text on an image, they can definitely let you know that, but they can't tell you whether it's good alternative text or not. That's more of a judgment call. That's where you come in and your experience and your expertise. And so we always emphasize learn those best practices and use the accessibility checkers as a support. And any accessibility checker that's worth their weight in money will have guidance as well. So it won't just check it for you, but it will tell you here's how you fix it. And that's a great way to also learn about accessibility and to improve your skills is by checking out that guidance. Because it usually gets really detailed and gives you good guidance on how to fix things. All right. So the AIM Center website, we're going to open it up for Q&A in just a second, but we want to point you to a resource on our website called Designing for Accessibility with Poor. And that's an entire section with lots of tips, lots of resources where you can actually take the next step and not just slide into accessibility, but pour accessibility onto your content. So you can take it to the next level with pour. And those are the 4 principles behind the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which are the international standard for accessibility and what our national law, Section 508, is based on. Or references now. So we encourage you to check out that section of the website. Let us know if you have any questions, any feedback. And by the way, this beautiful icon that you're looking at, that was created by our design team at CAST. And again, this is one where we worked as a team to create the accessibility description. So on the screen, you'll see different representations of content. There's a book with Braille on it. There's a mobile device with different display options. There's a screen that's playing a video and has the captions turned on. There's a smartphone where somebody's listening to the content and it's reading the alternative text that says water on it, or it reads it as water. And then there's a keyboard, a mouse, and a switch axis for those different ways that people can interact with the content. So again, that's an example of where together as a team, we came up with the alternative text. And I think it was a lot better for it. Rather than just one of us coming up with what we
Beautiful
call
image description.
How about that? On the fly in the middle of a webinar. I'm getting better and better.
So we have a couple questions that were from earlier that I want to make sure we don't miss. So,
absolutely, go for it.
Yeah.
Charlotte asks, this was back in the link section, does the speaker icon automatically show up when you insert a link? And maybe she needs to add more info in the chat on that.
Yeah, I may need a little bit of information. Again, that speaker icon, that was just something that I inserted as a demonstration so that you could hear how a screen reader would read that link. So if you put in the entire URL, the screen reader will probably read the domain name, right? So like cast.org or aim.cast.org. It kind of recognizes some of those words and it'll read them out loud correctly. But once you get past the domain name with a long web address like the one we shared on that slide, it's going to start reading it 1 character at a time. And so that's not really helpful, right? It's just a string of random numbers and letters and even symbols. So we want to make sure that we make the link text more descriptive. A screen reader will always announce the word link whenever it comes across a link. So that's something you don't need to include in that link text. So a screen reader will say something like link, and then whatever the descriptive text is that you've used for the hyperlink.
That's the same. That's also true for images. Is that correct, Luis?
Correct. So it will say, depending on the screen reader, you know, it may use the term image and then read the description that you've provided. So you don't need to include words like image of or graphic of. That would be redundant for the screen reader user. So thanks for pointing that out.
And Chelsea had a question on any guidance or resources on how to maximize accessibility for documents individuals are accessing on their cell phones, specifically regarding filling out documents on a cell phone without having to download an additional app.
So that is a topic that we're going to address in a separate webinar, where we're going to look at, you know, the other aspects of accessibility, but a lot of the practices that we've shared today also apply to mobile, right? So making sure the text is not too small, making sure that you're choosing a font that's easy to read on the screen, that becomes even more crucial when you have limited real estate. You have a small screen. So a lot of these tips are not specific to the computer. They apply to mobile devices as well. And Mindy, you do a lot around mobile as well in your social media role. So any other tips?
Absolutely. Well, I would agree that a well-structured document or well-structured slides will work well on any device. But it's also important to QA your stuff. So for example, if you think that most of your students or your participants are going to be, or some of your students or participants are going to be on their phones, make sure you take a look at the stuff before you send it out. Look at it on your phone and see if it makes sense to you and see if the order is correct and see if the font is large enough, all of those things.
Yeah, she specifically highlights difficulty with students that are filling out forms on their smartphones and graphic organizers that are fillable on different types of phones.
Yeah, and that's a challenging one. Not all formats work well on the mobile devices, specifically PDFs. I'm visually impaired myself, and I have a difficult time with PDFs on mobile because they require me to do a lot of panning around since I can't resize them as easily as other formats. So I would say if you have something interactive, the more that you can use forms. So for instance, tools like Google Forms or SurveyMonkey that are specifically designed to take in information from people and that have also been designed to work well on mobile devices. The more you can do that, the better. But formats like Microsoft, even Microsoft Word, you can create forms in Microsoft Word, but they don't work really well on mobile or on the desktop for that matter. So just like Mindy said, just test it out on a mobile device so that you can see how it works.
And I just put a link to one of our projects that's under development right now, but you can actually access it through the Google Suite. And it's called Corgi. It's corgi.cas.org. And it doesn't have much content in there right now, but we're working on that. And we're working on a new version right now that should be out by the summer. And that is actually, the whole project is about filling out forms for graphic organizers in the Google Suite. So look for more information about that or try it out. Let us know if you have any feedback.
Absolutely. All right. So I know we have a few questions in the chat. Again, as I mentioned, we will address those in the handout. So we probably won't get to all of them this afternoon, but you can visit the handout that's going to be shared when the recording of this webinar is also posted. So a reminder that this is recorded. It's going to be captioned, and then within a week, there will be the recording, handout, the slides, and then the handout will have a Q&A at the end that will cover a lot of these questions. So Mindy, this is your favorite topic. So I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about social media accessibility as a bonus for you all.
Yes, that's right. So hopefully some of you are out there on social media. And when I say social media, I mean anything from Twitter to LinkedIn to Facebook to Instagram, any of those platforms. And I'm sure that there are 10 more that popped up just as we were speaking. But these are tips that you can actually use on any platform of social media that you choose. And they're a little bit, they go along with Slide for sure, but they're a little bit different because social media acts a little bit differently than documents and slides. So my 5 tips are: use plain language in your tweets or your posts to make sure that you include everybody for that good old cognitive accessibility. Use camel case hashtags. So camel case is, I'm just going to put a hashtag in the chat right now for UDL chat or AIM for all. Camel case hashtags differentiates the different words in your hashtag by capitalizing the first letter of the word. And that makes it much easier for screen readers to actually identify the words in your hashtag. But it also helps sighted people to identify the different words in your hashtags. Also, image descriptions. You can actually add image descriptions for the images that you post on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. I even noticed the other day that Hootsuite, if you use that platform to post on multiple social media channels at once, which is one of the tools I use, you can actually pre-populate the alt text for Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn all at the same time, which is a fabulous improvement. It used to be you couldn't do LinkedIn or Facebook, so that's a great improvement to our social platforms. Also, make sure that whatever you're linking to, the videos, the audio have captioning, of course, but also think about audio description for your videos. And you can learn more about captioning and audio descriptions in another one of the fabulous AIM Center webinars. And because we cannot put clothes on our naked URLs in social media, we haven't figured out quite how to do that yet. If you do have a URL in your post, which most posts do, please try to put that at the end of your post so that the characters don't get read out loud right at the beginning for our screen reader users. But also consider using link shorteners like bit.ly or tiny URL, or there's one in Twitter that's built right in, or Owly, or, you know, there's a ton of link shorteners out there. All that does, first of all, I like Bitly personally because I can track how many people have clicked that link, but also you can customize that link so it actually reads as actual words, like Luis did on the Bitly link for the slides for this webinar, and the rest of the webinars in this presentation, so that the screen reader actually reads words that are meaningful for the screen reader user and the users that are just visually looking at your link. So I have a whole document with these 5 strategies all spelled out. They explain what camel case hashtags are. It gives you some information about captioning and audio. It gives you some links to the link shorteners, all sorts of resources. And if you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to ping me and ask. I've got my email and my social accounts linked right there.
And I would throw in another tip related to the link shorteners. If you have a document that you know is going to be printed, like it may be a handout or maybe instructions for your students, you can create a descriptive link for people that are accessing it on the device. And then in parentheses, next to that descriptive link, put in the shortened link, the shortened URL, so that people who are printing it out, then they have something that they can type into their web browser when they get back to their computer. So that's another helpful tip of how you would handle that. And again, like Mindy said, you can, with most URL shorteners or link shorteners, you can customize the ending so that it can be more descriptive. So that can be helpful. And by the way, did you notice here that there's a link below that image that says image description on it? Anybody notice that? Well, that is an example of how we would handle a complex image like this one. And so again, what I've done is created a link right underneath the image, and then that link points to another slide where there's a long description. So the long description, because this is a more complex image, describes it in more detail. So that's the way that we would handle it in a slide deck. You know, on a document, we can use the reference tools that's built into Microsoft Word or Google Docs. And what those reference tools will do is that we can add the long description as an endnote at the end of the document. And as a bonus, if you just want to print out those descriptions, you can do that as well, because they're going to be at the end of your document. So it can be really, really helpful to do that. All right, so let's see, we have 3 minutes. So I just want to share a couple of things for you before we end the webinar today. Again, we're going to address the questions that we don't get to through our handout, but you can also reach out to us. So we do have a task for you. We want you to put what you learned today into practice. And the task is for you to share, review the 5 tips for social media accessibility that Mindy just shared. And by the way, that document is a great exemplar of an accessible document. So that's another thing you can do, is look at that document for inspiration. And then we want you to post on social media and to create an accessible tweet with all of those great tips that Mindy just shared with you. So we invite you to do that, and then we want you to tag us so that we can see your post. And again, I'm just putting it out there. Bonus, if you record yourself doing the electric slide, I want to see that. That will make my week. That will make my year. 2020 has been rough, so I could really use some, some bright spots. And then the last thing here is just a reminder that we are having office hours. This week, we're just going to have one set of office hours on Thursday from 4 to 5:30. So this is an opportunity for you to ask questions. So if we didn't get to your question today, if you want us to sit down with you virtually and go over anything step by step with some guided practice, we're here for you. We'll be happy to do that during those office hours. So take advantage of them. The webinar is just one component of the technical assistance that we're providing to you. So again, there'll be the office hours, there'll be some supporting videos, there'll be the handout. There's much more than just this hour that we're spending together this afternoon. And then I want to invite you, if you like what you saw today, you can come back next Monday, the 21st, from 3 to 4. We'll be doing the final webinar in this series. But don't get too sad, because we're already planning other webinars based on your feedback. and your suggestions. And so this webinar is going to focus on making math accessible, because we know math can be a special challenge in documents, in presentations, and on the web. It can be difficult to make math accessible. So we're going to focus on what we're calling mathtastic. We're going to make it mathtastic. That's going to be our catchphrase for that webinar. So we invite you to join us for that next week. And of course, you can always reach out to us. Both Mindy and I are pretty accessible on social media. And then we have an email address. You can reach out to us on Twitter or Facebook. So either one of those channels are excellent.
And Luis, can you just clarify, is the next webinar on math on Monday or Tuesday?
Oh, sorry, it's on Tuesday, because
Tuesday,
Monday is a holiday in New England.
Okay.
Something around, I think it's called Patriots Day. So we would love for you to give us some feedback. There is a survey. And by the way, here's an example of a shortened link. It's a bit.ly link. And Leslie's going to drop that into the chat. Unfortunately, it's not live on Zoom anymore, but you can copy and paste it into your web browser. It's Distance Ed Webinars, and it's webinar number 3. And again, that's using Camel Case. So Distance Ed Webinars and the number 3. So we would love your feedback through that survey. So I want to thank you all for being with us this afternoon. We hope you found this webinar helpful and that you learned a lot. We look forward to your posts on social media where you share what you've learned today. I want to thank Mike from ACS Captioning Services for doing the captions this afternoon. Thanks so much, Mike. I want to thank my co-presenter, Mindy. I always learn so much every time I co-present with you. And then finally, Janet has been doing a great job of flagging these questions for us. And Leslie, as always, answering some of the logistical questions in the chat and also posting those links. So I know that we have a great team on hand whenever we do these webinars. So thank you, everybody. I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon and a great week. Talk to you soon.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining us.